Okay, are we ready to go?
Yes. We,
Vandana. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Tisarana Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dhammang saranang gacchami, Sanghang saranang gacchami. Dutiyampi Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi Dhammang saranang gacchami. Dutiyampi Sanghang saranang gacchami. Tatiyampi Buddhang saranang gacchami. Tatiyampi Dhammang saranang gacchami. Tatiyampi Sanghang saranang gacchami. Panchasila Anatipata Veramani Sikapadang Samadhiyami Adinadana Veramani Sikapadang Samadhiyami Kamesu Michachara Veramani Sikapadang Samadhiyami Musavada Veramani Sikapadang Samadhiyami Sura Meraya Majapamadatana Veramani Sikapadang Samadhiyami. Okay. Tonight we're going to speak about the way to Nibbāna. Now, what we're doing is we're practicing what the Buddha calls Satipatthana. And this is an approach to meditation practice that the Buddha developed. Wait a minute, I forgot to record. So we'll start again. Tonight we'll talk about the way to Nibbāna. Now, what the Buddha developed an approach to meditation practice which puts mindfulness at the center of the whole thing. And he calls this Satipatthana, which could be translated as the foundations of mindfulness or the applications of mindfulness. And in his discourses in the suttas, there's a whole variety of teachings about Satipatthana. But generally what's regarded as the main text is what's called the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the applications of mindfulness. And it's found in two versions, one in Majjhima Nikaya and a slightly longer one in Digha Nikaya. And this is, in a sense, the root text of the practice that we're doing. And today and tomorrow, we're going to look at the introduction to this discourse, the Udesa, where the Buddha gives an overview of the whole thing. And tonight in particular, what we'll do is look at the first sentence in the discourse, where the Buddha says, "This way, the 4 applications of mindfulness is a one-way street for purifying beings, transcending sorrow and distress, vanishing pain and grief, attaining the right path, and realizing Nibbāna." So this is how he begins to talk about the practice. And you notice that he begins with purpose. In other words, why are we doing this practice? What's it for? And I think most people, including, I would say, most people in Buddhist societies, so most people who would regard themselves as believing Buddhists, most people do mindfulness practice for their physical, social, and psychological well-being. Now, that clearly is the purpose of secular approaches to mindfulness. So, for example, mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, which is widespread in the modern world, and all of the offshoots of that. This is part of a secular meditation movement, and there's even a form of secular Buddhism. And these secular approaches, what they have in common is they do not see themselves as reaching out for something transcendental and remote and abstract, like Nibbāna. Basically, what they're concerned with is well-being. I want to improve this life. Now, this is a very good purpose to have. Like, there's nothing wrong with this motivation. It's a very good one because it's practical, it's realistic, and it gets us started. But if we look into it a bit deeper, we could ask, it gets us started on what exactly? And for the Buddha, it gets us started on the path, or in this case, what I've translated as street, Ekayana Magga, the one-way street or the one-way path. And the Buddha uses this idea of a path or a street or a way, Magga, a great deal. So, for example, the Eightfold Path, Atangika Magga. Anybody who's spent 5 minutes looking at the Buddha's teachings hears about the Eightfold Path. So that this idea of a path or a street or way is used a great deal. Now let's just tease out a couple of the implications of the metaphor of the path. So the first thing, the most obvious thing about a path is that a path is something that people have traveled before. Someone else has been this way before me. If no one has been this way before, then we do not have a path. Perhaps we have a desert. Perhaps we have a wilderness. Perhaps we have a jungle. But we do not have a path. If we've got a path, we know someone's been here before us. And the Buddha really emphasizes this in his teaching. In one discourse, Nagara Sutta, the city, the Buddha tells the story of somebody wandering through a forest. And the implication is trackless forest. So this would be a wilderness, a jungle. And then this person stumbles upon, quote, an ancient path, an ancient road, traveled upon by people in the past, unquote. And then he follows this path and he discovers the ruins of an ancient city, because this path is going somewhere. It's going to the city. And the Buddha goes on to explain that his discovery of the path that leads to Nibbāna, which of course is the city, is just a repetition of the same discovery made by Buddhas in the past. It's the same. This Buddhism that we experience today, one day in the future, it will disappear because it's impermanent, like everything else. As time goes by, even the memory that there was a way to Nibbāna will disappear. And then sometime in the future, someone else will discover traces of that path in the jungles of the chaos and the suffering of that time. So for the Buddha, this is really, really important. This idea that this is not a new invention. In a sense, it's part of nature. It's available, in other words. It's not something that the Buddha invented. And in particular, what we're getting at here is when we recognize that we are on a path, part of that recognition is that we are not on our own. There are other people on the same path. There are people who have preceded us, who have moved along before. There are people who will follow after us. And we're just the latest batch of travelers going on the journey. This is one of the reasons why we chant, in particular, one of the reasons why we chant in Pali. Because the chants that we do this time of night, these are very ancient. These would have been chanted in the Buddha's lifetime. And by chanting them, and in particular doing it in the original language, it's like we're acknowledging we are just the latest bunch of travelers on this path. Many people have gone along it before, and many people will follow. And today we are on this path together. It's a group effort. It's not something that we're doing alone. So first of all, a path is something that someone has been on before, that other people move along. And the second aspect of the path metaphor that comes to mind is that every path has a destination. A path is going somewhere, and it's going somewhere very specific. So let's translate magga as road. The road to Perth, for example, is going to Perth. It's not going somewhere else. So if you're driving to Perth and you happen to be looking out the window and you're puzzled about the lushness of the landscape, and then suddenly you see a sign that says Kuala Lumpur this way, you know you're on the wrong road because it's the wrong destination. So mindfulness meditation, the applications of mindfulness is a path, and it has a specific direction. It's going somewhere. And its destination, the Buddha says, is Nibbāna. And he emphasizes this very strongly when he calls the applications of mindfulness a one-way street, ekkayana magga. Magga, of course, is way, street, path. Ekkayana is eka ayana. Eka is one, ayana is going, literally going, a one-going way. So a one-direction way, a one-way street. Now, this image of the one-way street is very strong, and the Buddha doesn't use it very much at all. It's quite rare. And what it suggests is that once we start moving down this street, our arrival at the destination is inevitable. It will happen. And every step that we take takes us closer to it, whether we know that or not. Whether we're interested or not interested is completely irrelevant. The fact is, every step takes us closer to that destination. Yet, as we said, most practitioners are not practicing for Nibbāna. They're practicing for something more modest, more achievable, less abstract. For most people, including most Buddhists, Nibbāna is too distant and idealized to be considered a real possibility. It's like something you read about and it's kind of vaguely comforting. It's nice to think that there are some people in the world who attain Nibbāna, whatever that means. But for me, no, I don't think it's going to happen. So does this make the idea of Nibbāna useless for us? And I don't think so, because even if we consider it a far away ideal, like a guiding star, the ideal of Nibbāna gives us a sense of direction. And again, a path has direction. How can we know that we're on the right direction? The ideal of Nibbāna gives us a sense of direction. It helps us navigate this path by reference to this ideal. So knowing something about what the Buddha was talking about when he talks about Nibbāna is actually useful for the practitioner. So let's talk about it. Now, mind you, every time I talk about Nibbāna, I'm reminded of the advice that I was given many years ago when I was teaching at Blue Mountains Insight Meditation Center. And I was advised by a fellow teacher. He said, look, whatever you do, don't talk about Nibbāna. I said, why not? And he said, look, no one's interested. Don't talk about Nibbāna. It just gets people confused and worked up. And I said, okay. And I completely ignored him. And every retreat, I talk about Nibbāna. What to do? Now, the warning was sensible because it's quite difficult to talk about Nibbāna in any way which is going to be meaningful or useful. And in fact, what we're going to do first in order to get a sense of this is we're going to take a step back and look at the kind of language the Buddha uses when he's talking about his project and the way that he uses language to convey it. And one thing about the Buddha's teaching is he is very, very careful in what he says. He picks his words and his expressions very carefully. And he does this because as he's not so much said, but thought, a week after his awakening, when the thought of teaching first arose in his mind. So as a young man, he was enlightened, awakened under the Bodhi tree. And then he spent about 6 weeks in the area, basically recovering from the nuclear blast. And of course he was wondering what to do next. And after about a week, the thought popped up in his mind, well, I could teach the way to this enlightenment. But then he decided, no, I'm not going to do it. Because as he said, or thought, as the case may be, the Dharma or the Dhamma in Pali is, quote, deep, difficult to understand, difficult to awaken to, peaceful, exalted, beyond reason, subtle, experienced only by the wise, unquote. And so he thought, no, I'm not going to try. But fortunately for us, he was talked out of this refusal, and in fact, he started teaching. But clearly, it's a problem. How can we put Dharma into language? It's a big problem. Now, one method that the Buddha uses is that he would speak in use different kinds of terms, different kinds of words. And he would sometimes speak in cognitive words, and he would sometimes speak in affective words. And these are quite different. So cognitive words, these are words that convey knowledge, understanding. In other words, they belong to the realm of the head. So, for example, the knowledge of how to be a skillful accountant and balance the books of a big company and maybe hide their mistakes. This is cognitive. It's up here. It's in the head. And sometimes he would use affective words, and these convey feeling and response. So they belong to the heart. So, for example, how I feel about my career as an accountant, whether I enjoy it, whether it gives me a great deal of satisfaction, or whether I dislike it and I only do it for the money. So we have the realm of the cognitive and the affective, the head and the heart. And we have words that belong in one of those two categories. So, for example, the Buddha talked about what he saw as our fundamental problem. What is it that gets in the way, that prevents us from living a flourishing life? When he talks about the fundamental problem, sometimes he uses, and he also talks about the solution. What's the solution to our problem? And when he talks about the problem and the solution, sometimes he will use cognitive words, sometimes he will use affective words. So, for example, the problem, when he's talking about the fundamental problem that we have, sometimes the Buddha would use the cognitive term avijja. And this is ignorance or delusion. So the fundamental problem is that we don't know what is going on. And in our delusion, in our confusion, we act in ways that are destructive to ourselves and to others. So this is cognitive. It's up here, it's in the head. And sometimes he uses, when he's talking about the fundamental problem, he will use the affective term, tanha. Now this is literally thirst, but it's usually translated in English as craving. So here he's saying, our basic problem is we are driven. Imagine being incredibly thirsty. Now, imagine you are incredibly thirsty, but meanwhile, you're a person, for example, you enjoy collecting stamps. If you're incredibly thirsty, how much time are you going to spend thinking about your stamp collection? Well, you're not, are you? The only thing that's on your mind is, how do I get a drink? And you're going straight for wherever you can find it. And whatever is in the way, you're going to push aside to get to that. This is drivenness. This is tanha, literally thirst, but usually translated craving. So the basic problem here is that we are driven, and in our drivenness, we act in ways that are destructive to ourselves and others. And drivenness is of the heart. It's not the head. I might have a very great understanding, but if I'm driven, I don't care. I'm just going for it. So similarly, when the Buddha is talking about the solution to our fundamental problem, what we are practicing for, what's at the end of the path, sometimes he will use the cognitive term bodhi, usually translated enlightenment, but literally awakening. Now this is, again, it's up here. It's cognitive. It indicates a state where we really do understand what is going on. For example, insight meditation. In sight, we can see what's going on. Vipassana. This is cognitive. Oh, I can see what's going on. Sometimes he uses the affective term nibbāna, or in English, nirvana. And here he's talking about the heart, the state of the heart, when we are no longer driven. See, do you see the difference? So sometimes he's talking at the cognitive level, sometimes at the affective level, sometimes at the level of the head, sometimes at the level of the heart. Nibbāna belongs here in the heart. And now, one of the basic ways in which he spoke about Nibbāna was using the metaphor of the going out of a fire. We're going to have a couple more talks about this in this retreat. We're going to explore this fire. So he talks about the state of being free from drivenness and from obsession. And he uses the metaphor of the going out of a fire to talk about it. So the Pali word Nibbāna, the Sanskrit nirvana, is based on the root va, V long A, to blow, as in the blowing of the wind. So the movement of air. And the prefix nis. And so nirvana or nibbana means to go out, to become extinguished. So it's the going out of a fire. And in particular, the way the Buddha talks, one way in which the Buddha talks about it is it's the going out of a fire when it runs out of fuel. Now, when a fire goes out, what are we left with? Coolness, ease, peace. So the image of coolness is very important. One writer commented that in European language and culture, warmth has a very strong positive feel to it. So the idea of seeking refuge from the cold and going into light, the warmth, the fire, that this is very positive. Because in Europe they have long, cold winters. But of course, the Buddha didn't live in Europe. He lived in North India. And in India, North India, you have long, hot summers. And so the Buddha had, and the people around him, had intimate experience of the unpleasantness of being oppressively hot. So imagine trudging through a desert. You are hot, parched, exhausted. And finally, you come to an oasis. What you find is green grass, shady trees, a stream of clear water flowing through. And what you find is relief, peace, rest, refreshment. These images that suggest what the Buddha means by Nibbāna. So, for example, the Buddha talked specifically about the Nibbāna as the going out, the exhaustion of three fires in particular. And these are the fires of attachment, aversion, and delusion. Now, these are the what's called the akusala mula, the roots of the unwholesome. These are the cause of all our pain and suffering from the Buddha's perspective. So these are, and he says, these are fires. They burn us and they destroy our lives. So he says in one discourse, enchanted with obsession, enraged with anger, blinded by delusion, overwhelmed, their hearts trapped. People aim at their own ruin, at the ruin of others, at the ruin of both, and they experience mental pain and grief. It's a very powerful statement. Enchanted with obsession, desire, enraged with anger, blinded by delusion, overwhelmed, like the fire is just blasting everything. Their hearts trapped. People aim at their own ruin and the ruin of others. And again, get the sense of aim, direction, path. And then the Buddha goes on, but if obsession, anger, and delusion are given up, they do not aim at their own ruin, nor at the ruin of others, and they experience no mental pain and grief. This is Nibbāna, which is visible in this life, immediate, inviting, attractive, and understood by the wise. You notice how he's not talking about Nibbāna as pie in the sky, as something, to be experienced many lifetimes later on. He's talking about this lifetime, visible in this life, immediate, right now, inviting, attractive, and at the end of it, understood by the wise. In other words, not understood by people who are not wise. One contemporary Theravada teacher who really emphasizes this was Ajahn Buddhadasa of Thailand. And one thing that he said, he said that everybody, every adult, let's say, has experienced Nibbāna many times, but very briefly. And he says that the reason we know this is because if we didn't, we'd be insane, all of us, because there'd be no relief from the suffering. So for him, for Buddhadasa, Nibbāna is something which simply naturally occurs, but it's very subtle, and usually the experience is quite brief, so we don't notice it. But notice that the way the Buddha is talking here, that Nibbāna is both ethical and psychological. So without Nibbāna, we are so lost in our instinctive obsession, anger, and delusion that we live in ways that are destructive to ourselves and to others. We just naturally do it. It's it's like the obvious thing to do. This is the ethical aspect of Nibbāna. When we experience Nibbāna, then we're not driven to do that, and we don't do that. Without Nibbāna, because we are dominated by obsession, anger, and delusion, we experience mental pain and grief. So this is a psychological aspect. With Nibbāna, we are in the opposite situation. So we're not living in a destructive way. We're not suffering psychological pain and grief. So let's look at, again, go a bit more deeply into this idea of Nibbāna as the going out of the fire. And here we'll look at the role of fuel. So if we ask the simple question, what sustains a fire? What keeps the fire going? So for example, the two candles that I've got up there. A fire is sustained by its fuel. As long as the fire has fuel, it will burn. As long as those candles are still feeding the fire will burn. As soon as a fire runs out of fuel, it ceases. It goes out. It cools. So the Buddha would often speak about Nibbāna in terms of the going out of a fire when it runs out of fuel. Now, when we say this in English, it's like, oh yeah, that's what happens to a fire. What we don't get is the pun that the Buddha is using because he's speaking in Pali. What his audience would immediately recognize. Because in Pali, the word for fuel is upadana. And the same word is what in English we translate usually as clinging or attachment. So what fuels the fires that burn us? Upadana does. Our clinging and our attachment, that's upadana. So I'm sure, if you spent any time listening about teachings about the Buddha, you know that clinging and attachment are very bad things. And they, what translates, the meaning is the same as fuel. It's the same word. What sustains the fire? Now, it's important that when we're talking about upadana, clinging or attachment, that we recognize we are not talking about normal human desire or dependency. So all of us desire. Like none of us will get out of bed in the morning if we didn't desire. In fact, if we had no desire, we would need 24-hour care. We couldn't look after ourselves. We are all dependent upon relationships with others for our functioning. No one is independent. Everybody's dependent. Everybody is attached to others. If a human being is not attached to others, then, I mean, speaking as an amateur and as a layman, I would suggest they're probably clinically insane. So the Buddha's not talking about normal human desire and dependency. He's talking about something else. And we get a sense of what he's talking about when we think about the particular form of desire that we would call addiction. This is closer to what the Buddha's getting at. So this is a relationship to what we desire when we are bound so closely to it, so tightly, that this desire defines our identity to ourselves and to others. So if you look at the experience of addiction, one major aspect of the suffering of addiction is the feeling of being trapped, the feeling that there's no way out of this. So when we feel trapped, then we genuinely cannot imagine life without the object of desire, because we cannot imagine who we would be without it. So without my substance, who would I be? I don't know. Without this person to whom I'm deeply attached, who would I be? I don't know. Without this job, without this position in the world, without this status, who would I be? I don't know. Without this belief, who would I be? I don't know. I do know I don't want to find out because it's terrifying. Because without this, I, quote unquote, would cease to exist. I would die. Because fundamentally, from the Buddha's perspective, we are what we cling to. We are what we feed upon. Because again, clinging is fuel. We're feeding upon it. We're sustaining ourselves through it. So let's look at a couple of practical examples from our meditation experience. Have you ever had the situation where you're calmly meditating, marching firmly along the path to Nibbāna, and suddenly a particularly painful story comes up in your mind, some incident that happened in the past, which was just awful. And suddenly you find yourself reliving that incident or that time or that trauma or whatever. So this story that we are telling ourselves is incredibly painful. And of course, we know the basic instruction. Thinking has arisen, let it go, come back to the meditation object. But we can't let it go. Why can't we let it go even when it's painful? Why does this thought fuel the stories that we tell ourselves? It's because this particular story, this particular thought defines us. It tells us who we are and what the world is. It makes us more real as the thinker of that thought, as the one who lives in the world defined by that thought. So the thought defines us. It tells us who we are. The thought limits us. So fire is limited by its fuel. If it can't find any fuel, it goes out. When we are the person defined by the story that we're telling ourselves, we are trapped as the character in this story. So we cannot be anyone else until this story is replaced by another one where we're trapped as the character in that story. And the thought feeds us. We're eating it. So have you noticed that, for example, you'd be meditating, a painful story comes up in your mind, you start to go through it, this happened, boom, 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 and you come to a particularly painful bit, you stop, and you go back and you repeat that bit. You move on a bit more, stop, go back, just go through this one again, and then move on. Has this happened to anybody else? Why do we insist on chewing over particular parts of the story? Because it's feeding who we think we are. It's feeding our identity. So in the same way that a fire is defined by what fuels it, it's upadana, by what it clings to, it's upadana, we are defined by what fuels us, by what we cling to. It's, the Buddha is saying, it's essentially the same process. So a fire is hot and agitated and restless, burning from its fuel. We are hot, agitated, restless, burning from the fires of attraction, aversion, delusion. So these are the elemental fires that feed us, and they feed our sense of normality. They feed our sense of the real world, of what is possible, what is impossible. And so they trap us in this sense of fixed normality. Now, what happens when these fires of attraction, aversion, and delusion come to an end? When the fire goes out, what happens? We naturally find coolness, peace, ease. So in our normal lives, we go on and on playing different characters in our internal dramas. And as long as we are stuck in this process, we are in, quote unquote, samsara. Samsara is the restless moving on through life after life after life after life. Now, when this process ends, we are in Nibbāna. So Nibbāna represents the end of this process of burning and clinging, and the peace and the calm that naturally emerges when we're not restlessly trying to make something else happen in order to feel real and adequate. So this is Nibbāna, and you can see it's a human experience. It's not cosmic pie in the sky. So this practice is designed to take us to Nibbāna. How? What's the relationship? What are we doing in this practice? What we're doing is we are tracking the nature of our experience. We're trying to develop a felt continuity of awareness. And as we do so, we're seeing how our experience changes over time. And we begin to discover what's really going on just underneath the surface, where we don't normally look. And when we do that, we begin to feel the fires that are burning our experience. And this afternoon in the Beginner's Mind group, we discussed the perennial problem that people have of postponing their meditation, which I think we've mentioned in the workshop as well. How amazingly easy it is to postpone meditation. How instinctive it is to not today, tomorrow. And I think this is because when we practice, and especially when we practice effectively, we begin to feel those fires. They become more obvious because that's what's underneath the surface. And we instinctively back off. So, for example, when we do meditate, particularly when we do a retreat and the practice is quite intensive, we discover something which is quite shocking, which is that our normal relationship to experience is infected by a sense of something to gain or something to lose from the event. In other words, we realize that we relate to every experience that we have in terms of what's in this for me? What do I get out of this? We discover that this is our colors, our basic relationship to experience. Now, this is the manifestation, the appearance of tanha, thirst, craving. Each of us is burdened by a deep sense of lack, a deep sense that something essential for my life is missing. And we're driven to reach out and to hold on to something that will fill this gap, that will fill this emptiness. So to come back to the image of the fire and the going out of the fire and the drivenness, we are burning with thirst and we are driven to find something that will quench our thirst, something to cool the fire. And so we're driven to manipulate every experience to make it right for me, to fix my problem. So we're never actually satisfied with how it is. We're always trying to turn it into something else. And always judging the experience. Because basically, it's all about me. So, for example, this retreat is all about me and what I will get out of it. So, what I do a meditation period, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever, say 30 minutes. This period of meditation is about me. It's about my meditation practice, my progress in meditation. And this is why we're constantly judging our experience. So have you ever had the experience, for example, when you sat in meditation, had a session, the bell goes at the end, you're immensely relieved, phew, and you think that was a total waste of time. Have you ever had that experience? Have you ever had the experience where you're sitting in meditation, the bell goes, and you think, oh, gosh, how unfortunate. That was such a fantastic meditation period. And you notice that both of these judgments are based on manipulation. Is this good enough for me? Will this fulfill my purpose? This is the drivenness. This is the thirst, the craving. This is the restless burning of the fire, this endless judgment and manipulation of the experience. And of course, this sense of drivenness also infects our social relationships. All the other practitioners who are sharing this retreat, really they're all bit players on the stage of my own personal drama. Now, this is the normal human condition. This is how we all live most of the time. What the practice is doing is training us to cool down, training us to let the fire burn out. And the basic training is to learn to experience any event, this event right now, as just what it is, without resisting it, without holding on to it, without trying to turn it into something else, without trying to justify it in any way. And this is the practice of noting. that we talked about before, or what Nyanaponika Thera calls bare attention. And this was a term Nyanaponika wrote The Heart of Buddhist Meditation in the mid-50s. And it was this term, bare attention, was one of the bits of his book that was lifted out and made part of MBSR. And this is noting, that when Mahasi Sayadaw talks about the noting, this is what he's talking about. So noting is to be deliberately aware of something, and full stop, just to be aware of it, just to aware the experience. So whatever the experience is, it might be as simple as breathing. Breathing in, breathing out. Just this in-breath, just this out-breath. And then at some point we're distracted. So I might be caught up in obsessive thinking. I note it. It's just thinking. I might be caught up in emotion. I note it. It's anger, it's sorrow, it's desire, it's anxiety, whatever it is, just be aware of it. Whatever pulls me away from my meditation object, I note it. This is what it is. It's just this, and then come back. And of course, the fire is burning. It's burning with restlessness. And every time I recognize the restlessness, I just note it. That's restlessness. Come back. I'm judging the experience as good or bad. I recognize that's just judgment. Come back. And so on. So it's like the fire is burning and I'm noting the burning. Burning is just burning. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just hot. Like with the elements we were doing this morning. Heat is just heat. Coolness is just coolness. Movement is just movement. That's all. Full stop. So what we're doing in this noting is cultivating a radical simplicity in our relationship to experience. Now, normally what we do is we use whatever experience arises as fuel for making something else. Something that promises us pleasure or pain. Something that will keep the fire burning. But in this practice, we're training ourselves to stop making something out of this. To stop using it as fuel for something else. This experience is just this experience. That's all. So this is a relationship of radical simplicity. When we're developing a relationship to experience where we are not trying to get something. We are not trying to avoid something. We are not trying to make something else happen. And the way to this is through the simplicity of just note. This is what it is. Just this, just this, just this, just this thought, just this sensation. That's it. That's all. So as this practice matures, as it gains momentum, we begin to cool down, and this becomes noticeable. Our habitual responses and our reactions begin to fade. Things begin to simplify, they begin to clarify. We find that we don't construct as much out of our everyday experiences as we did before. We begin to feel what it might feel like to live without chronic anxiety and interference. And this is the movement toward Nibbāna. And in the Satipatthana Sutta, in the discourse we're talking about, the Buddha describes this later in the discourse as living independently without clinging to anything in the world, without clinging, without using anything as fuel to burn more fire. So as we do this practice, naturally we start to, as the fires naturally start to go out. They start to reduce. We stop chasing our delusions and attachments. The fires die down, and then Nibbāna naturally emerges. And you notice it's just natural process. It's no special divine intervention. It just naturally happens. But the road to it is through the cultivation of this radical simplicity in terms of our practice. And that comes from the noting. It's just this, just this, just this. So this is the boot camp of the practice, doing this again and again and again and again and again. And every time we note, every time we deliberately aware the experience, in that moment, we are not adding more fuel to the fire. And if we stop adding fuel to the fire, it goes out. And again, natural process. Okay, I think we're done for the night. Thank you very much. Any questions?